Alright, so now we will go step by step into a deep dive into those different steps involved for creating a variety of tunnels that we've just seen. And here's the first part. I want to again recreate that texture that we see on the tunnel. So this is before we actually use the tunnel animated tunnel filter. Before we use that tool, we need to create some sort of a surface, metallic looking or maybe a rock looking concrete with different patches of different colors, and so I want to explore how to do that. In fact, let's start with a slightly bigger image this time. Let's go with 1024 by 1024. Ooh, I don't have a preset for that. I'll just put it in there. Uncheck the constraint, put it in 1024 for the height as well, and go. Alright, so I'm going to store this image just so we have a quick snapshot to get back to it. I'm also going to invert it. Now there's a couple of ways to do that. You can go invert right there from the image menu and store that one. So if we need the black image quickly, we can we can quickly get to that as well. I mentioned there's a couple of ways to invert it. There's obviously also the filter collections. You can see color invert somewhere here. There it is, invert value, negative. For black to white, that will work just the same. You could also just switch the two colors here in the lower left on the toolbar. You can make the secondary color black and then erase to that, and then secondary, click on it for the secondary color to be white and click on that. So there's so many different ways to get back to a blank clean sheet. And what I want to do now is to have the rectangle fill tool. Now with the rectangle fill tool, there's actually a couple of styles. There is a sort of a filled mode. First of all, there's two modes. There's a rectangle outline mode. If you click the tool in the upper left corner, you see this little diagonal divider on that icon. If you click it in the upper left half, it will be a rectangle area that's not filled. And so it uses the current brush, and it looks like I'm blending and mixing my tools here. I wonder if I have some sort of a setting on my brush. I need to pick a different color. Oh yeah, this is the palette in mix mode right now. Let's go back to Turkey Baster and select the colors. There you go. So I can go and select my different colors, and it's still not a filled rectangle. Okay, now this in itself could be a really interesting pattern to develop as well. In fact, you could make that a seamless texture simply by enabling the right here, this little icon to enable the mirror, vertical and horizontal mirror, and then whatever you draw is also being drawn in the other axis on the other side. And so you could quite easily develop patterns that are repetitive or symmetrical, and also will be seamless in many cases. So that's something worth exploring as well. But let's go back to the rectangle fill. So the rectangle outline was the one we used here. Now there's also a rectangle fill, and that's if you click the lower right half of that same icon. Right, and by the way, many times when you right click on this, you have other options. This one here will show the fill settings. Right, so many of these icons you can either left click it to activate it. In some cases you can left click the upper left side or the lower right side. Still a left click, and read the tooltip. If you see that there is a right click option, you can see the settings for that. Right, so some of these will have some extra features and capabilities that might be useful at some point. So as you are exploring and learning Dog Waffle for the first time, be sure to do the right click and try that. Now I'm going to reset the symmetry here and disable that. So click on that and select the clear, and then I'm going to zoom out a little bit and erase everything. And you know what, let's go undo once and then just store this. You never know, you might need that. We might like to use that for something else. Let's keep a little snapshot of that. And now we can erase it. Click on this stored white copy, or the black one if you want to erase to black. Let's start with that, and this time use the filled rectangle. So the filled rectangle will fill a rectangle to whatever the current fill settings are, and you see them right here, or you can see here the fill setting option as well if it wasn't shown yet, or you right click on the fill tools. Any of these fill tools, when you right click them, these two oval or rectangle fills will also give you the fill settings. And there's yet another place where you can grab that fill setting, and that's over here. There, fill settings. That will open that same floating window. So why a fill settings tool? Well, because there are many different ways to fill it. You could use a plain color, which is what it's doing by default right now. You can, let's see, I'm not in the right tool anymore. Let's go to this one here. Okay, so we have the rectangle fill again, and I'm using different colors, and so it's filling at those different colors. And one thing I'd like to do is perhaps use a pattern instead. So there are pattern fill options as well, and you can choose a pattern such as a brick pattern or some of the many presets, or you can load your own image into the custom brush and start using that. Let's say I'm using this pattern here, and you see a little sneak preview here. You can click that and hold the cursor to see it over the entire fill settings window, and you can warp it into a shape, and so when you fill inside of this, let's say with the fill tool, you'll see that it will tile it in there with the pattern fill, or it will do some other types of fancy adjustments there to fill it in. So let's say we have a shape with the rectangle fill, and you can look at that. You can actually fill the rectangle directly with this mode already on. You don't have to first set the rectangle there and then go fill it with the fill tool. So that's another interesting mode to use. You can give a slightly different opacity, perhaps right there. There's probably an opacity somewhere. There it is. In the top left on the second context bar, you can have different opacities, and so that's where we'll start exploring creating our interesting looking patterns, is to actually have it at very low opacity but do this painting or this generation of the patterns a few times over. Right now in this case I have actually a pattern in my brush that, or in my fill settings now, that really works well because it adds so much fine detail as well as larger areas, and that's really what I'm seeking, is to have sort of a collection of a variety of different things, some very distinct vertical features that I'm doing right now, and perhaps some of them at slightly higher opacity. Let's go change that opacity a little bit, and so they will be a little bit more dominant. And if you wanted to have something a little bit more repetitive or precise, what you could do is switch to the swap image. Let's click right there to switch to the swap image, and perhaps enable the artist guides or even the drawing grid. Show me the visible grid and also lock to it. That's the drawing grid, and that will lock to it. Maybe not that close, maybe a little bit more, like let's give it about 36 distance here and about 36 on the other, although we really don't need to have them exactly the same. Well, let's do that just for sake of simplicity here. And okay, I'll leave it alone here. And we can actually use these adjusters here to get to the right value. And so now if I'm zooming in, I can go, and you know how I do that, right? Zoom in, I can do Control Shift, hold the Control and the Shift key down, and then with the left button you can move it around, and the right button sideways, moving the right button sideways, you can zoom in and out. Now you can also use these these tools here, the magnifying glass or the pointing hand, pointing finger. That will also let you do that. So, but now if you have that snap grid enabled, it's a little bit easier to get kind of a nicely contained repetitive position. I'm going to go to full opacity with that, for instance, right? And then I can see it better. And as I'm drawing this, I can easily make it so that it's you know, at very predictable, repetitive, even spacing, and the size. They're all really lined up nicely now. Oh, this one's off, so I'm going to undo that and try a little bit below. There you go. And so let's say I wanted to pick that up as a custom brush, and I'll have a sort of a very interesting pattern. Perhaps I need one more here. Let's try to make it approximately a square. So perhaps this one goes a little bit too far, but let's disable the grid now and the artist guides and see what we have. We don't need this part. Now, how would we erase that if we didn't want this part because it would be in our way? What we could do is use the rectangle tool or the selection tool. Let's use the selection tool, for instance, and select this part and then erase it. We can right click on the erase tool, right, the clear tool, and say clear the selected with the primary color. Now, what is our current primary color? Well, we'll find out. Let's go do that. That's not the one we wanted, obviously, so let's go do that again. We see the primary was this dark red, and then there is a white. That's the secondary color, so let's do that with the secondary color. And the selection is still showing here. That's the marching ants. And we can also enable that for overlay mode, so it shows what part is selected, and the pink is the part that is not selected. Alright, so that cleared it. Now we can clear the selection, and we are back to just our little pattern here. Let's say we want to pick that up and then stamp it down back on the regular image, right? So in here we can go and pick it up in a couple of ways. I would say perhaps we can just pick it up with the custom brush tool right there and draw the selection like a marquee selection like this, and pick this up as a custom image in the brush, right? So where do you see that? Well, you have to be on the brush tool, you have to go enable the preview, and now you see it in your brush as your brush image. You can also see that over here in the right of the sidebar, that the left top, the big icon in the top left corner, that one actually shows the current brush image. It's a custom brush, and we can store that, and we should, because we'll probably create a few more. And you can see that it's got some transparency. That's because the background color, which is white here, happens to also be the background color, or the secondary color. It cues to that, it keys to that same color to make that transparent. And if you wanted to, you could change that. Now let's see another way to pick up that that image. Let's say we go and use the magic wand and make a selection. Click on the outside, there where it's white. So you see everything that's been selected is still white, and everything that's not selected is now showing with pink or with the marching ants or both. And what we want to do obviously is invert it. We want to select the part that is currently not selected. So you could invert the selection, or you could first store it. Here is to invert the selection, but you could also actually store it. Let's go back to this. Let's go to store the alpha. That's showing your selection, and you can invert it there in the stored copy and then replace the current one with the one that we have here in the stored copy. So now we actually have the same result here. And at that point I could say, hey, let's go pick that up. We have a custom brush that's waiting to be created simply by picking up or selecting this area. Now there's two ways. Again, we've done already one, which is with the custom animated brush custom brush selector tool. Or we could say, well, I have something selected, let's just pick that entire selected area, not the entire image, just the part that fits in the bounding box of anything that is selected. So the brush tool here has an option. The brush menu has an option at the top called use selected as brush, right? So when you do that, it picks again that exact area that is selected, and you now can store that one, and it's probably going to look very similar. Store and manage it. It's going to probably look very similar to the other one, right? So we have one brush we can paint with, and what we'll do is we'll give it a little bit more distance on the, let's go make sure we have the brush tool here, and we give it a little bit more distance, the step distance here, so that you have to move a little bit farther away to actually get some sort of a painting effect from it. Just a little bit more sparse, right? That's the idea. It's not too widely populated there. And then other things we want to do is perhaps also, let's go to the settings here, the brush settings, and pin this one down. And what you'll see with the brush settings, that we have now that step at 142, that's pretty big, but we also want some randomness to it. It's still following the mouse, and it's predictable as to where it's going to appear. And what we could do is give it some random position, and have and it's a little bit easier to see that it's doing that now if we reduce the step a little bit, just temporarily. But you can now tell that it's doing like it's kind of jumping erratically around the position where your mouse is, right? So without the random position, if you have it at 0 here, it's going exactly where your cursor is moving, right, as you draw with the left button down there to drag this and paint with it. Well, but if you increase this random position, you can see that it's not a perfect lineup anymore. And so you have the random positioning of that, and the next thing we'll do is again set the step distance a little bit higher, so that it's really kind of random, and wherever you go it's still not exactly there. And then we may also want to have random size. Now that one's a little bit trickier because it may take a lot of time on slow computers to change the size. So what we do is we make that optional. You go to the custom brush, since this is a custom brush, and you do allow the transforms. You have to enable that. Now the sizes are also affecting the size. I mean, the random scaling is also, the random size is also affecting the size of the brush. There are other things you could do with that, such as random saturation if there were some colors of any interest, or the random value if you wanted some of them brighter and some of them darker. Right, and then also you might use the opacity attached to a tablet. If you have a tablet pen that you're using to do this painting, you could make it so that the harder you press, the more opacity you get, and when you press very lightly, it would be just using kind of very transparent, very light pressure would make it very transparent. Now I'm using a mouse here, so I can't really demonstrate that, but we are pretty much done here. What I'll do is I'll simply use this back on the main image and just paint over that in very low opacity. Let's go to a very low opacity here, and then on top of that I'll make it a mode that's not like this. This is very subtle. I'm going to make it a darkening mode, so I need to subtract. I need to make it gradually remove the brightness from the existing pixels. So that's the mode. I'm looking for the mode right there and say subtractive. So now it's gradually making it darker and darker. And I just go all over here and plaster that around. And what you're now looking at is just a mix of a lot of different lines of different sizes, of different opacities or darkness, and I think that one pretty much will serve the purpose of what I'm looking for, which is to create a crazy pattern there. Now another way to do that would be to use perhaps take a photograph of a printed circuit board, right, and just put that in. We'll perhaps consider that in a different tutorial, but here we'll just say one more thing. Let's make this one seamless. Let's go make seamless right there. Let's just take the default parameters. That's good enough, and store that. And you know what, just in case we decide we want it without the seamless, let's go also undo back to the original before we made it seamless and store that one too. Alright, so we do have a couple of images. We may want to save them to files, and let's go put this one in place, and that's the one that we will now use for all sorts of effects, such as, for instance, adding a little bit of lighting effect with the stylize. You can see that you can put the light source around it here and perhaps bring the light source down, give it some distinct color and something that will make it look a little bit like teal. And then also add some nice, very bright specular highlights. All of that will make it really interesting for the final image. You can change the amount of the elevation, the height of the texture, the smoothness to focus more on the big picture or big features. Adjust all sorts of parameters here. And that can apply across the entire animation sequence too. Now we don't have an animation with this image yet, so I'm going to create one now. I'm going to say let's create an animation of just 99 frames. So that will play about 3 seconds if we set it to 30 frames per second. It will be a little bit more than 3 seconds, and it's always good to have a few extra frames. And so now I'll just finish this with the tunnel. That's the animated right there, and let's go to the tunnel, and let's say we want to just move it towards us. We don't want to rotate it or something, so we just want to dive into it. Let's select the Shift X and go. And that may look like it's a little bit odd here, but it will be just fine afterwards. It's just not refreshing every time. However, I am using a size of 1024 by 1024, and this filter currently is optimized for 512 by 512. So we have an area where the pattern tiling is not quite that perfect. It is actually better if we go, let's see, if we go this way, let's take the seamless one and create a animation again. And really I should have first stored this. Let's go and store this animation, because that's what we can do now with version 9.2. We can go store to disk, for instance, and that way that animation is very easily at one click, we can restore it, we can use it again. Right, all we got to do is click in here and it will restore that. So now let's say I want to make this smaller. Let's resample that. Before I do that, let's just see what happens if I also add some rotation to that tunnel. So let's go to animated tunnel again, and this time I'll leave it with the default. I will still move forwards, but I will also shift it sideways, and that will give that rotational spin effect. And the thing is that, again, at 1024 by 1024 it's fairly decent, but it's not perfect. This area in the upper left initially is no good, and then gradually closes in, and now we have a perfect tunnel. So this is one thing that we hope to perhaps improve in future generations of dog waffle, but right now what I recommend is have a look at using this at 1024 by 1024, excuse me, at 512 by 512. Let me restore this image. That's why it's nice to have it in this stored copy here. And then I'm going to resample the image. That will be probably one of the last things I'll do. Resample it right there to half the size. Let's click this divide by 2, so it's now 512 by 512. I know that one works really well. And the next thing we'll do after we've done that is, of course, store this animation, because we just never know how soon we'll need to get back to that one. So store this one to disk as well. Maybe we don't need the 1024 version anymore. Let's just keep it around for a little while. But right now we'll go into the filter and animated tunnel, and let's just use the default one here. And you can see that this is now nicely tiled and looks great all over. Alright, so in the next tutorials we'll look at some other things we can do now that we have this animation. We want to give it a little bit more depth, some embossing or some lighting effects even, maybe place 2 or 3 light bulbs along this tunnel, make it look like we're actually walking into that corridor and there's some light bulbs illuminating or shining onto the inside of this tunnel. We can play some tricks to simulate that. We also will probably want to have the back end of the tunnel kind of disappear, either very bright or very dark, like into blackness. And then later we'll see how to cut some holes in there so that we can start seeing through the windows or the broken holes on the walls and turn it into that more sophisticated tunnel that we've seen in the other tutorials. Alright, thanks for watching, and we'll be seeing you soon on the continuation of this mini-series.